I used to believe that holding on was a sign of strength, that if I just tried harder, loved deeper, or proved my worth, people would stay. But here's the hard truth. Sometimes the bravest thing we'll ever do is let go. A few years ago, I sat across from a close friend who had slowly drifted away. We were doing that thing where both people pretend everything is fine when, deep down, we know it's not. And finally I asked, "Are we okay?" What I got was a vague, polite answer, the kind that keeps the peace but never tells the truth. I left that conversation knowing something had shifted, but I wasn't ready to face it, because facing it meant accepting that this person, someone I had loved and invested in, was no longer choosing me the way I had been choosing them. And that's when I realized something. Love is not measured by how tightly we hold on, but by how much we respect ourselves when it's time to let go. Now, before you start thinking, great, so I should just cut people out of my life, no, that's not what I'm saying. Letting go isn't about resentment. It's not about slamming doors or proving a point. It's about honoring your own worth, even when it hurts. And the research backs this up. Studies on attachment and self-worth show that people who struggle with letting go often tie their identity to external validation. We make someone else's presence a measure of our own value. But here's what we forget. When we hold on to relationships that no longer hold us, we abandon ourselves in the process. So let's talk about it. What does it really mean to love yourself enough to let them go? If being in a relationship, romantic, friendship, or family requires you to shrink yourself, silence your needs, or constantly prove your worth, it's not love, it's fear. And love rooted in fear isn't love. It's control. I've seen this play out in so many ways, and maybe you have too. You start noticing that every time you speak your truth, you're met with resistance. Maybe it's subtle, an eye roll, a dismissive laugh, a change of subject. Or maybe it's more direct. Why do you always have to be so sensitive? You're overthinking it. You're too much. So you adjust. You choose your words carefully. You soften your edges, quiet your voice, and make yourself smaller just to keep the peace. But here's the thing. Peace at the cost of self-betrayal isn't peace at all. It's self-abandonment. The research backs this up. Studies on relational dynamics show that when people consistently suppress their true feelings or needs to avoid conflict, their levels of self-worth and emotional well-being take a serious hit. We think we're choosing connection, but what we're actually choosing is a slow erosion of our sense of self. And the more we do it, the harder it becomes to recognize ourselves. I had a friend once, a friend I adored. We laughed together, supported each other, and shared our lives in that effortless way that real friendships do. But over time, something started to shift. Every time I brought up something important to me, something that mattered, I felt a small but noticeable distance between us. I'd say something vulnerable, and instead of curiosity or care, I'd get brushed off or met with silence. And I'd think, okay, maybe I'm just overreacting. That's what we do, isn't it? We gaslight ourselves. We convince ourselves that our feelings don't matter as much as maintaining the relationship, that if we could just be less emotional, less opinionated, less of a burden, then maybe things would be okay. But here's the truth that took me way too long to learn. If being loved requires you to abandon yourself, it's not love. Love doesn't ask you to disappear. It doesn't demand that you make yourself easier to digest. Real love, the kind that's worth holding on to, creates space for the fullness of who you are, not just the parts that are convenient. And I get it. Letting go of relationships that make you feel unseen is terrifying, because sometimes the fear of being alone feels bigger than the pain of staying. We tell ourselves stories like, what if no one else loves me the way they do? What if I'm being too harsh? What if this is the best I can get? And those stories keep us stuck. But here's what I found. The moment you stop shrinking for someone else, the moment you stop negotiating your own worth for the sake of keeping a relationship intact, you get to experience something life-changing: freedom. Freedom to be fully known, freedom to ask for what you need, freedom to walk away, when you realize you are the only one holding on. Because at the end of the day, love that asks you to be less is not love. It's fear. And fear is a terrible foundation for a relationship. So if you're finding yourself constantly questioning whether you're too much, maybe the real question is, am I too much? Or have I just been choosing people who can't hold the fullness of me? Because the right people, the ones who truly love you, won't ask you to fit into a smaller version of yourself. They'll meet you where you are, in all your messy, complicated, beautiful humanness. And that kind of love, that's the only kind worth holding on to. The absence of someone doesn't mean the absence of love. Letting go doesn't erase what was real. It doesn't mean the memories don't matter. It just means that love at its healthiest must also include freedom. The freedom for both people to grow, even if that means growing apart. This is one of the hardest lessons to learn because we are wired for connection. Our brains are designed to seek belonging, to attach, to hold on. So when someone leaves, whether it's the end of a relationship, a friendship that fades, or even the loss of someone who meant the world to us, it can feel like a rupture, like the love itself has disappeared along with them. But love isn't that fragile. It doesn't vanish just because someone is no longer in our lives. It doesn't make what we shared any less real. And yet so many of us struggle with this idea because we equate presence with permanence. We think that if a relationship ends, it somehow negates everything it once was. But that's not how love works. I remember sitting with someone who had just gone through a breakup, one of those breakups where both people still cared but knew they couldn't keep holding on. They looked at me and said, if we really loved each other, shouldn't we have made it work? And I could feel the weight of that question. Because that's what we're taught, right? That love is supposed to conquer everything. That if we try hard enough, sacrifice enough, compromise enough, we can make any relationship last. But here's the truth. Love and longevity are not the same thing. Some of the deepest, most life-changing connections we will ever have won't last forever. And that doesn't mean they weren't meant to be. It just means they weren't meant to stay. There's a well-documented psychological concept called the Zeigarnik effect. It's the idea that our brains tend to hold on to unfinished business more than completed stories. So when a relationship ends, we replay the moments over and over, trying to find the missing piece. Where did it go wrong? What could I have done differently? But love doesn't work like a puzzle. It's not something we can force into place. And sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves and for them is to stop trying to turn endings into beginnings. I know how hard that is. I know what it feels like to have someone become part of your world only to wake up one day and realize they're no longer in it. And I know that sometimes we hold on mentally, even after we've let go physically. We keep checking in on them from a distance, scrolling through old messages, reliving the moments that felt like home, because in some way it feels like keeping them close. But here's the thing, healing isn't about pretending love never existed. It's about making peace with the fact that it did. It's about understanding that just because a relationship ends, it doesn't mean the love disappears. It doesn't mean the laughter wasn't real, or the lessons weren't valuable, or that the connection didn't serve its purpose in our lives. Love is not a possession. It's not something we get to keep in a box, untouched and unchanging. Love is an experience, a force, a moment in time that shapes us. And just because someone is no longer standing next to us doesn't mean their impact is gone. It means they were part of our story, and that story still matters, even if the chapters no longer include them. So if you're struggling to let go because it feels like you're losing the love itself, remind yourself of this. Just because someone is absent doesn't mean the love wasn't real. Some people come into our lives not to stay, but to teach us something, to help us grow, to walk with us for a little while before the path splits. And instead of focusing on what's missing, we can choose to honor what was. We can choose to believe that love in all its forms is never wasted, because the love that truly belongs to us, the love that is meant to stay, will never require us to chase it. It will choose us. fully and freely just as we are. Boundaries are the highest form of self-respect. We teach people how to treat us by what we tolerate. If someone consistently makes you feel unseen, unheard, or unvalued, your job is not to convince them of your worth. Your job is to stand firm in it. Now, I know boundaries can be a tricky word for a lot of us. Some people hear it and think selfishness, others think conflict. And for those of us who grew up believing that love means sacrifice, boundaries can feel like walls, like something that pushes people away. But that's not what boundaries are. Boundaries aren't meant to keep love out. They're meant to protect the love we have for ourselves. I've spent years studying vulnerability and connection, and one of the most surprising things I've learned is that the most compassionate, deeply connected people aren't the ones who say yes to everything. They're not the ones bending over backward to please, to fix, to make sure everyone else is comfortable, often at their own expense. No, the most grounded, wholehearted people, they have boundaries like iron. That's because real love, healthy love, requires clarity. It requires knowing where you end and someone else begins. And when we don't set boundaries, when we let people cross lines over and over just to avoid discomfort, we send a dangerous message. My needs don't matter as much as keeping this relationship intact. I used to struggle with this. I used to think that being a good friend, a good partner, a good person meant always saying yes. Yes, I can help. Yes, I'll be there. Yes, it's fine. No worries, no problem, whatever you need. And I'd do it all with a smile, convincing myself I was being kind. But then I'd feel drained, resentful, like I was pouring everything I had into people who only showed up when it was convenient for them. And here's what I finally had to face. I wasn't being kind. I was being afraid. Afraid that if I said no, people would leave. That if I spoke up, I'd be seen as difficult. That if I stopped overextending myself, I'd lose my place in their lives. That's the lie we tell ourselves, that setting boundaries will push people away. But the truth? The people who truly love you will respect your boundaries, and the ones who don't, they're benefiting from you not having any. Studies on interpersonal relationships show that people who lack boundaries experience higher levels of stress, anxiety, and even depression. Why? Because constantly abandoning yourself for the sake of others creates a cycle of emotional exhaustion. And yet, so many of us convince ourselves that it's just easier to avoid the tough conversations. I don't want to cause a problem. I don't want to hurt their feelings. I don't want to be the bad guy. But avoiding a conversation doesn't erase the truth. It just buries it under resentment. I once had someone in my life who only reached out when they needed something. You know the type. The calls that start with, "Hey, how are you?" But within seconds you realize it's not about you at all. It's about what they need. And every time I'd drop everything to help. Because that's what you do for people you care about, right? Except one day I was going through something really hard and I needed support. So I reached out, and you know what I got? Silence. That moment hit me hard because it forced me to see the imbalance. It made me realize that I had been teaching this person that I would always be available no matter what, while expecting nothing in return. And that wasn't their fault. That was mine. Because we don't just allow how people treat us, we shape it. So I made a choice. The next time they called needing something, I paused, and instead of my usual, "Of course, what do you need?" I said, "Hey, I care about you, but I've noticed our friendship feels one-sided. I want to be here for you, but I also need to feel like I can rely on you too." It was terrifying. My heart was pounding. But you know what happened? They pulled away. They didn't like the boundary, and that hurt. But you know what hurt worse? The years I spent pretending it was okay. Because when you finally start honoring your own needs, some people will resist. Not everyone will celebrate your growth, but the ones who love you, the ones who truly see you, they won't just respect your boundaries, they'll appreciate them. So if you're constantly over-explaining, over-apologizing, or bending until you break just to keep the peace, I want you to ask yourself, is this really peace, or am I just avoiding discomfort? because the right people, the ones who deserve a place in your life, will never make you choose between them and yourself. Closure is not something you get from someone else. It's something you give yourself. And that's a hard truth to swallow because we're wired for resolution. Our brains crave certainty, a clean ending, a moment where everything finally makes sense. But real life, real relationships, they don't always work that way. Sometimes the apology never comes. Sometimes the explanation never arrives. Sometimes the person you need answers from has already moved on, while you're still standing there, holding all the broken pieces, waiting for something, anything, that will make it hurt less. But here's the thing. Waiting for someone else to bring you peace is like waiting for the person who broke you to put you back together. It keeps you stuck. It keeps you tethered to a story that's already over. And at some point, you have to decide that your healing isn't going to be dependent on their willingness to give you closure. I used to think closure meant understanding. That if I could just figure out why things happened the way they did, why they left, why they changed, why they chose something or someone else, then maybe I could move on. Maybe I could put it all in a neat little box, tie it up with a bow, and walk away without any loose ends. But life doesn't always give us neat endings. Sometimes all we get is a mess of emotions and the choice to either hold on to them or start untangling them ourselves. There's a psychological principle called the need for cognitive closure. It's this deep, innate desire to resolve uncertainty, to fill in the gaps so we can make sense of what happened. And when we don't get that closure, our brains do something fascinating. They create explanations. They tell stories, often ones that make us the villain. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe if I had been different, they would have stayed. And those stories, they can keep us trapped for years. I've seen people spend decades waiting for an apology that never came, for an acknowledgement that never arrived, for someone else to finally validate what they already knew deep down, that they deserved better. And I get it, I've been there too. I've sat with unanswered questions, with the frustration of, how could they not care? How could they just walk away like that? But here's what I've learned. Closure isn't about what they say or don't say. It's about what we choose to accept. At some point, you have to decide that your healing is more important than their explanation. That you don't need their permission to move forward. That you don't have to keep reopening the wound just to see if they finally feel the weight of what they did. Because closure doesn't come from someone else tying up the loose ends. It comes from realizing you don't need them tied up to move on. And I know how unfair that feels. It feels like you're doing all the emotional labor while they get to walk away, consequence-free. But the truth is, the people who hurt you don't get to decide when you're free. You do. And the moment you stop waiting for an apology, for understanding, for justice, for them to finally see what they did, the moment you stop giving them that power is the moment you take it back. I had a conversation once with someone who had been ghosted by a close friend out of nowhere, no explanation, just silence. And they kept asking me, how do I move on without understanding why? And my answer was probably not what they wanted to hear. You move on by accepting that you may never understand why. Because sometimes people leave without giving us a reason. Sometimes they don't have the courage to tell us the truth, or maybe they don't even know the truth themselves. And while that's painful, it doesn't mean we have to carry their silence as our burden. It doesn't mean we have to make their lack of closure our prison. So if you're sitting in that space, the space of unanswered questions, of unresolved endings, of wondering when it will stop hurting, let me tell you this, you are allowed to move on without an apology. You are allowed to close the door yourself. You are allowed to give yourself the peace that they never did. Because waiting for closure from someone else is just another way of waiting for permission to heal. And you don't need permission. You just need the courage to let go. Letting go isn't just about walking away from a relationship, a friendship, or a person who no longer fits in your life. It's about stepping fully into the life that does fit. And that's the part we don't talk about enough. Because yes, releasing someone can be painful, but what comes after the rebuilding, the rediscovery, the way you start to take up space in your own life again, that's where the real magic happens. There's this moment after you let go, after the storm of emotions has settled a little, where you start to hear your own voice again. And at first it's quiet. Maybe it's been drowned out for so long by someone else's needs, someone else's expectations, someone else's version of who you were supposed to be. But then little by little, it gets louder. You start remembering who you were before you had to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's world. And you start wondering, what would it be like to live fully in my world? Psychologists call this process self-expansion. It's the idea that relationships, especially deep ones, shape our identity. We merge with the people we love in ways we don't even realize. Our habits, our interests, even the way we see ourselves can become intertwined with them. And when they leave, it can feel like we're left with this empty space, this void. But what the research shows is that this void, it's actually possibility. It's the space where we get to grow again, to reclaim who we are outside of that relationship. I've sat with so many people in this space, the space between what was and what will be. And I always tell them the same thing. You're not losing yourself. You're meeting yourself again. Maybe for the first time in a long time. And yes, that can be scary. Because when we've spent years focusing on someone else, on their happiness, their approval, their presence in our lives, we can forget what our happiness even looks like. But the beautiful part, we get to find out. And this isn't about forcing yourself to move on before you're ready. Healing isn't a race. There's no deadline for when you should feel okay. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, am I holding on to this because it's still serving me, or because I'm afraid of what comes next? Because the truth is, letting go isn't just about releasing someone else. It's about making space for yourself. It's about allowing your life to expand beyond the limits of that relationship. I remember talking to a woman who had just ended a long-term relationship, and she told me, I don't even know what I like anymore. I don't know what I want to do with my time. I don't know who I am without them. And my response, then this is the beginning of something really important. Because that moment, the moment where you don't know, is actually the moment where everything is possible. This is where you start experimenting again, where you try things just because you want to. Maybe you take up a hobby that got put on the back burner. Maybe you start saying yes to invitations you would have turned down before. Maybe you sit in a coffee shop alone just to remind yourself that your own company is enough. It doesn't have to be some big dramatic reinvention. It's just about slowly, intentionally stepping back into your own life. And I know what some of you might be thinking, but what if I don't feel ready? What if I still miss them? That's okay. Missing someone doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. Healing and longing can exist in the same space. You can love what was and still honor what needs to be. But at some point, you have to stop waiting for the past to call you back. You have to decide that your future is worth stepping into, even if it feels uncertain. Because here's what I know for sure. The life that is meant for you will never require you to stay small. The love that is meant for you will never ask you to abandon yourself. So if you've been standing in that in-between space, if you've been waiting for the right time to reclaim your life, let me tell you, this is it. The right time is whenever you decide that you are ready to take up space again. Because you are not just meant to survive this loss, you are meant to grow from it. And I promise you, what's ahead is so much bigger than what's behind. Letting go is never easy. It asks us to release not just a person, but the version of ourselves that existed in that relationship. It asks us to walk away from comfort, even when that comfort was painful. And it asks us to trust that what's ahead, what's waiting for us beyond the loss, is worth stepping into. But here's what I know. Choosing yourself is always worth it. Setting boundaries is worth it. Releasing what no longer serves you, even when it hurts, is worth it. Because you were never meant to live a life that keeps you small. You were never meant to stay in places that make you forget your own worth. You were never meant to hold on to people who have already let go of you. So if you're standing at that edge, wondering if you have the strength to move forward, let me remind you, you do. Even if it doesn't feel like it yet, even if the road ahead feels uncertain, even if your heart still aches for what was, you are strong enough to walk away from what is breaking you, and you are brave enough to walk toward what is waiting for you. Good luck on this journey of stepping back into yourself. And thank you. Thank you for showing up for this conversation, for choosing to do the hard work, for reminding yourself that you are worthy of more.